We are not in a quorum call.
Then we should not vitiate it.
All right.
Mr. President, my understanding is that the so-called Inflation Reduction Act may be coming to the floor in the coming days. And there are some people who think this bill is worth supporting. There are others who think that it is not. But whatever your views on this bill may be, let us be clear. As currently written, this is an extremely modest piece of legislation that does virtually nothing to address the enormous crises that working families all across this country are facing today. This reconciliation bill falls far short of what the American people want, what they need, and what they are begging us to do. Given that this is the last reconciliation bill that we will be considering this year, it is the only opportunity that we have to do something significant for the American people that requires only 50 votes and that cannot be filibustered. In other words, this is the opportunity, because on anything significant, we're not going to get 60 votes. So this, in my view, is a moment that should not be squandered. Mr. President, let us do what we too rarely do here in the Congress or in the corporate media, and that is take a hard look at the reality of what is going on in our country today. Very often we sit here and we argue about this, we argue about that, but we don't take a look at what's going on in America today, especially among working people and lower income people who do not have paid lobbyists here trying to get us to pass legislation to benefit them. People back home are just too busy working 50, 60 hours a week, trying to make it on Social Security, trying to deal with their student debt. They don't have the lobbyists here that the drug companies and the insurance companies and the fossil fuel industry has. What's going on in America today? For a start, in the richest country in the history of the world, half of our people live paycheck to paycheck. And because of inflation, a bad situation has been made worse. Millions of people today are wondering how they're going to pay their rent, how they're going to buy the food to feed their kids, how they're going to pay off their debt. That is what's going on for half of the people in our country. I know we don't talk about them. They have no representation here, no lobbyists, no nothing, but that is the reality. Does this reconciliation bill address their needs? Does it raise the minimum wage to a living wage? Or do we continue to allow so many workers to try to get by on 10, 12, 13 bucks an hour? Does this bill make it easier for workers who want to join a union to be able to do so, or they continue to be attacked by their employers, making it hard to form a union? No, this bill does nothing to address that reality. Mr. President, at a time when, tragically, this country has the highest rate of childhood poverty of almost any major country on earth, does this bill extend the $300 a month per child tax credit that was so important to millions of families last year? Does it address that issue? Does it say that maybe there is something wrong when millions of children in this country are dealing with hunger and with other basic human needs? No, not a word in this bill addresses that. Mr. President, in my state of Vermont and around this country, families are paying on average about $15,000 a year for childcare, if they are lucky enough to find a slot. $15,000 a year. It's 1/3 of the salary of a family making $45,000. I don't know how people can afford childcare. And meanwhile, childcare workers earn horrifically low wages and poor benefits. At a time when we have the highest rate of childhood poverty of any major country on earth, does this bill address the dysfunctionality of our child care system? No, not a word. And again, this is a reconciliation bill where we only need 50 votes to make these changes. Mr. President, at a time when over 70 million Americans are uninsured or underinsured, when we spend twice as much per capita on health care as the people of almost any other major country, while insurance companies make tens and tens of billions of dollars a year in profit, when 60 million people a year die because they can't afford to get to a doctor when they are sick because they're uninsured or underinsured, does this bill do anything to help us create a rational, cost-effective health care system which guarantees health care for all as a human right, something that every other major country on earth does? No, the bill does nothing to address the extraordinary health care crisis that we face. Mr. President, at a time when 45 million Americans are struggling to pay student debt, and when hundreds of thousands of bright young people every year are unable to fulfill their dreams, unable to get a higher education because they cannot afford the high cost of higher education in this country, does this bill do anything to make it easier for young people to get a higher education? No, guess not. Doesn't do a thing. Doesn't do a thing on student debt. Mr. President, 55% of senior citizens in our country are trying to survive on incomes of $25,000 a year or less, which is something hard for me to understand, really is. Think about being 80, 90 years of age, trying to make it on $25,000 a year. Maybe your spouse has died. I don't know how you do it, but more than half of the people in our country who are seniors are trying to do that. Many of these seniors cannot afford to go to a dentist, and in Vermont, and I suspect in Arizona as well, there are senior citizens walking around without teeth in their mouth or with teeth that are rotting. There are seniors all over this country who cannot communicate with their kids or grandchildren because they can't afford a hearing aid. They can't watch TV because they can't afford a decent pair of glasses. Is there anything in the currently written bill to expand Medicare to do what some 75, 80% of the American people think we should do, and that is expand Medicare to cover dental care for seniors, hearing aids, and eyeglasses? No, this bill doesn't touch that at all. And when we talk about our seniors and disabled Americans, does this legislation do anything to help the millions who would prefer to stay in their homes rather than be forced into nursing homes? It's an issue I hear quite frequently in Vermont. Can't find help for someone to come to my house to help my mother or my disabled father. Does this bill address the crisis of home health care? Very serious crisis. No, not a word. Mr. President, I think there is no disagreement that we have a major housing crisis in America. Some 600,000 Americans are homeless, and nearly 18 million households are spending an incredible 50% of their limited incomes for housing. Everybody acknowledges that we have a major housing crisis and that rents are soaring. Does this bill, which supposedly represents the needs of the American people, even deal with housing? One word? No, it doesn't. Mr. President, I understand that in our politics today, super PACs and billionaires play an enormous role in what we do here and what we don't do. Just yesterday, we saw the power of billionaire super PACs electing corporate candidates who represent their interests and defeating candidates who represent working families. That's the way the political system is, been made worse since Citizens United. But right now, in our country, and I know we don't talk about it very much, I hear almost no discussion on the floor, we have more income and wealth inequality than any time in 100 years. How do the American people feel knowing that 3 people own more wealth than the bottom half of American society? Does that sound like the America we believe in, the America we think we should be? We talk about Russia and Putin and the oligarchy over there. It's true. An oligarchy robs the country blind. We have an oligarchy here as well. 3 people own more wealth than the bottom half of American society. The top 1% owns more wealth than the bottom 92%. 45% of all new income goes to the top 1%. And what we have seen during the pandemic is billionaires becoming much richer while working people by the thousands die because they had to go to work to make a living. Today, CEOs of large corporations make 350 times more than their average workers. That's what's going on in America. I know we don't talk about it because we don't want to offend the people who fund our campaigns. It makes them uncomfortable to talk about how much inequality we have in this country, but that is the reality. Mr. President, not only do we have income and wealth inequality, we have another issue we don't talk about much, maybe a little bit. That is, we have more concentration of ownership than at any time in the modern history of this country. In sector after sector after sector, we have a handful of giant multinational corporations, often engaging in price fixing, who control what is produced and how much we pay for it. And I think many Americans now notice that at a time when we're paying increased costs at the gas pump, increased costs at grocery stores for food, surprise, 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 these large corporations are making record-breaking profits. Paying $5 for a gallon of gas, well, the good news is ExxonMobil and these other corporations are making huge profits. Unbelievably, Mr. President, 3 Wall Street firms now control assets of over $20 trillion. That is the GDP of the United States of America, controlled by 3 Wall Street firms. That of concern to anybody? Might be something we might want to talk about in a reconciliation bill? Nah, can't do that. These are very powerful guys, and we're not supposed to offend the wealthy and the powerful. These 3 Wall Street firms are the major stockholders in 96% of S&P 500 companies. Check out companies that products that you buy. Find out who owns them. Find out who owns the companies that you are familiar with, and time and time and time again, you will find that the major stockholders are these 3 Wall Street firms: BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. Does this bill do anything to even begin addressing the enormous concentration of ownership in our country and make our economy more competitive? Not a word. So my point, Mr. President, is that we are living in a moment of unprecedented crises. This bill does virtually nothing to address any of them. And this is the opportunity, because theoretically it could be done with 50 votes here in the Senate. If all the Democrats voted for it, any Republicans voted for it, would be great, plus the Vice President, we could do it. We could do it. But as currently written, it is not being done. Now, let me say a few words about what is in this legislation, a bill which has some good features. There are some good things in it, but it also has some very bad features. The good news, Mr. President, is that the reconciliation bill finally begins to address the outrageous price of some of the most expensive prescription drugs under Medicare. As you know, we pay by far the highest prices in the world for our prescription drugs, and for those under Medicare, this begins to address that issue. Under this legislation, Medicare, for the first time, would be able to negotiate with the pharmaceutical industry to lower drug prices. That's the good news. Bad news is that we will not see the impact of these negotiated prices until 2026, 4 years from now. Why? Got me, I don't know. But it will not go into effect until 4 years from now. And by the way, the pharmaceutical industry is the most powerful entity here in D.C. And if you think during those 4 years, whatever modest provisions are in this bill, they will not attack and get out, you would be mistaken. They will certainly work hard to do that, and they have 4 years to do that. 4 years to come up with an entire pricing structure. Because if you're not covering all of the drugs, they can come up with Me Too drugs that look alike, that sound alike, but they can evade these price controls. Moreover, with the possible exception of insulin, and that's not clear yet, this bill does nothing to lower prescription drug prices for anyone who is not on Medicare. Under this bill, at a time when pharmaceutical companies are making outrageous profits, the drug companies will still be allowed to charge the American people, by far, the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs. Now, if we had the courage to seriously address this issue, we know exactly what to do. It is very, very simple. For over 30 years, the Veterans Administration has been negotiating with the pharmaceutical industry to lower the price of prescription drugs. Moreover, for decades, virtually every major country on earth has done exactly the same thing. That is why in Canada, drug prices, in Mexico, drug prices, in Europe, drug prices are much lower than in the U.S. The result of Medicare not negotiating prices has been that today Medicare pays twice as much for the same exact prescription drugs as the VA, and Americans, in some cases, pay 10 times more for a particular drug than the people in Canada or in other countries. How insane is it that you have one federal agency called the VA that pays 50% of what Medicare pays? I mean, how crazy is that? So, Mr. President, when it comes to reducing the price of prescription drugs under Medicare, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We could simply require Medicare to pay no more for prescription drugs than the VA pays. End of discussion. A rather simple solution. And if we did that, we could save Medicare some $900 billion over the next decade. That is 9 times more savings than the rather weak negotiation provision in this bill. 9 times more. They get $100 billion, we would save $900 billion. And by the way, that money could be used to add comprehensive dental, vision, and hearing benefits to every senior in America. It could be used to lower the Medicare eligibility age to at least 60. And it could be used to extend the solvency of Medicare. Well, Mr. President, that is why I will be introducing an amendment to do just that and to make sure that Medicare pays no more for prescription drugs than the VA. Not a very radical idea, and I would hope that that amendment gets widespread support. Mr. President, in terms of the Affordable Care Act, this legislation will extend subsidies for some 13 million Americans who have private health insurance plans as a result of the ACA over the next 3 years. Without this provision, millions of Americans would see their premiums skyrocket, and some 3 million Americans could lose their health insurance altogether. This is a good provision. I support it. But let us not kid ourselves. The $64 billion cost of this provision will go directly into the pockets of private health insurance companies that made over $60 billion in profit last year and pay their CEOs exorbitant compensation packages. It would also do nothing to help the more than 70 million Americans who are uninsured or underinsured, and it would do nothing to reform a dysfunctional healthcare system that is not designed to make people well, but is designed to make the stockholders of private health insurance companies even richer. Now, let me talk about the issue of climate change for a moment, as it is dealt with in this bill. Mr. President, this legislation provides $370 billion over the next decade to combat climate change and to invest in so-called energy security programs. The good news is that if this legislation, as written, is signed into law, it will provide far more funding for energy efficiency and sustainable energy than has ever been invested before. Given the existential crisis that we face, given the fact that we are fighting to make sure that this planet remains habitable and healthy for younger generations, this clearly is not enough of an investment, but it is a step forward. It provides serious funding for wind, solar, batteries, heat pumps, electric vehicles, energy-efficient appliances, and low-income communities that have borne the brunt of climate change. That is the good news. However, Mr. President, the bad news is that this legislation includes a huge giveaway to the fossil fuel industry, the people who are causing the climate crisis. Now, it might seem a bit incongruous to people why we are rewarding the people whose emissions are driving the temperature of the earth up and causing massive destruction, but that is, in fact, what this bill does. Under this legislation, the fossil fuel industry will receive billions of dollars in new tax breaks and subsidies over the next 10 years, on top of the $15 billion in tax breaks and corporate welfare that they already receive every year. This is above and beyond what they currently get. In my view, if we are going to make our planet healthy and habitable for future generations, which I would hope that every sane human being believes we should, we cannot provide billions of dollars in new tax breaks to fossil fuel companies that are destroying the planet. On the contrary, we should end all of the massive corporate welfare that the fossil fuel industry already enjoys. Under this legislation, up to 60 million acres of public waters, 60 million acres of public waters must be offered up for sale each and every year to the oil and gas company before the federal government could approve any new offshore wind development. To put this in perspective, 60 million acres is the size of Michigan. Mr. President, let me read to you the headline that appeared in a July 29th article in Bloomberg, quote, Exxon loves what Manchin did for big oil in $370 billion deal, end quote. According to Bloomberg, the CEO of ExxonMobil called the reconciliation bill, quote, a step in the right direction, end quote, and was, quote, pleased, end quote, with a, quote, comprehensive set of solutions included in the reconciliation bill. Barron's recently reported that ExxonMobil, Chevron, and Occidental are just a few of the fossil fuel companies that would benefit the most under this bill. Now, Mr. President, if the CEO of ExxonMobil, a company that perhaps has done more than any other entity on earth to cause climate change, if they are pleased with this bill, I think all of us should have some very deep concerns about what is in this legislation. Further, under this bill, up to 2 million acres of public lands must be offered up for sale each and every year to the oil and gas industry before leases can move forward for any renewable energy development on public lands. In total, this bill will offer the fossil fuel industry up to 700 million acres of public lands and waters to oil and gas drilling over the next decade, far more than the oil and gas industry could possibly use. And, Mr. President, that is not all. The fossil fuel industry will not just benefit from the provisions in this reconciliation bill. A deal has also been reached to make it easier for the industry to receive permits for their oil and gas projects. This deal would approve the $6.6 billion Mountain Valley Pipeline, a frack gas pipeline that would span 303 miles from West Virginia to Virginia and potentially on to North Carolina. This is a pipeline that would generate emissions equivalent to that released by 37 coal plants or by over 27 million cars each and every year. Well, to my mind, that is a heck of a way to address the climate crisis. Mr. President, let me quote from a July 29th letter from over 350 environmental organizations, including the Sunrise Movement, Food and Water Watch, 350.org, and the Climate Justice Alliance, a letter addressed to the President and the Senate Majority Leader, expressing concerns about this bill. And this is what they say, quote, "Any approval of new fossil fuel projects or fast-tracking of fossil fuel permitting is incompatible with climate leadership. Oil, gas, and coal production are the core drivers of the climate and extinction crises. There can be no new fossil fuel leases, exports, or infrastructure if we have any hope of preventing ever-worsening climate crises, catastrophic floods, deadly wildfires, and more, all of which are ripping across the country as we speak. We are out of time. Therefore, we are calling on you, President, Majority Leader, to fulfill your promise to lead on climate, starting with denying approvals for the Mountain Valley Pipeline, rejecting all new federal fossil fuel leases onshore in the Gulf of Mexico and Alaska and everywhere else, and preventing any fast-track permits for fossil fuel projects. And, Mr. President, I would like to put into the congressional record the letter by these 360 environmental groups written on July 29th.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. President, here is what the Center for Biological Diversity had to say on this bill, and I quote, "This is a climate suicide pact. It is self-defeating to handcuff renewable energy development to massive new oil and gas extraction. The new leasing required in this bill will fan the flames of the climate disasters torching our country, and it's a slap in the face to communities fighting to protect themselves from filthy fossil fuels," end quote. Mr. President, in my view, we have got to do everything possible to take on the greed of the fossil fuel industry, not give billions of dollars in corporate welfare to an industry that has been actively destroying our planet. And I will be introducing an amendment to do just that. Finally, Mr. President, this bill has a tax provision in it. And under this bill, corporations will be required to pay a minimum tax of 15%. And that is good news, because we have many, many large, profitable corporations in this country, including companies like AT&T, Federal Express, and Nike, who in a given year make billions in profit and don't pay a nickel in federal income tax. And this provision has been estimated to raise $313 billion over the next decade. Further, under this bill, the IRS will finally begin to receive the funding that it needs to audit wealthy tax cheats. Each and every year, the top 1% are able to avoid paying more than $160 billion in taxes that they legally owe, because the IRS does not have the resources or staffing they need to conduct audits of the extremely wealthy. This bill will begin to change that. This bill would also make very modest changes to the so-called carried interest loophole that has allowed billionaire hedge fund managers on Wall Street to pay a lower tax rate than a nurse, a teacher, or a firefighter. And that's a good thing. But the bad news is that this bill does nothing to repeal the Trump tax breaks that went to the very wealthy and large corporations. Trump's 2017 tax bill provided over $1 trillion in tax breaks to the top 1% and large corporations, and this bill does nothing to repeal that. And, Mr. President, let's not forget, it is very likely that Congress will be doing a so-called tax extenders bill at the end of this year that could provide corporations up to $400 billion over the next decade in new tax breaks. If that occurs, that would more than offset the $313 billion in corporate revenue included in this bill. So, Mr. President, that is where we are today. This legislation virtually ignores every major crisis facing working families who are struggling so very hard to stay alive today, ignores child care, pre-K, the expansion of Medicare, affordable housing, home health care, higher education, raising the minimum wage, and more, ignores all of those issues. This is legislation which, at a time of massive profits in the pharmaceutical industry, takes a very modest step, which go into effect 4 years from now, to lower or control the price of medicine. So, Mr. President, this bill has, as I've indicated, some good and important provisions. At the same time, it has some pretty bad provisions, including massive giveaways to the fossil fuel industry. This is a bill of more than 700 pages, which was made public after a number of months of secret negotiations. In my view, Mr. President, now is the time for every member of the Senate to study this bill thoroughly and to come up with amendments and ideas as to how we can improve it. And I intend to play an active role in that process. Mr. President, thank you, and I would yield the floor.